I don't plan to start now.
Hello, hello.
Oh, yeah, sure.
All right. So, sorry, whoa. No one was ready. First of all, I want to thank everybody who is here for our annual, hopefully, Clash of the Professors. So we are the McGill Students Trading Society, and Gordon, our president, will talk more about us at the end. So I just want to first start with our introductions. So first and foremost is our moderator, Professor Dickinson. Professor, I'm trying to be nice. Professor Dickinson has taught in the economics department for over 25 years, during which time he has worked as a consultant for the Government of Canada and some provincial governments. His social policy consulting projects have included evaluating the Canada Pension Plan, the Old Age Security and Guaranteed Income Supplement programs for Canada's senior citizens, and assisting with the New Brunswick initiative to improve the education and employability of social assistance recipients. On a much different plane, he has been a consultant for Statistics Canada in designing and evaluating national and international indices of information technology. Welcome, Professor Dickinson. Up next, we have Professor Thomas Velk. Professor Velk is a member of McGill University's Economics Department. He's the former director and also the founding father of McGill's North American Studies Program, NAS. In the Economics Department, he teaches money, banking, political economy, policy, trade, and related courses. A proud Republican, Professor Velk has been a visiting professor at the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve System in Washington, D.C., and at the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress. Recently, he was a guest editor of 2 special issues of the journal Antitrust Bulletin, wherein he contributed several articles. Welcome, Professor Velk. Last but not least, we have Professor Christopher Ragan. Professor Ragan is an associate professor here in McGill University in the economics department. His doctorate is from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Professor Ragan has served as president of the Ottawa Economics Association, also known as the OEA, and special advisor to Bank of Canada. Professor Ragan focuses on inflation, monetary policy, and exchange rates, saving behavior, and eco-fiscal policies. He is also the author of the popular book used in most economics courses, Macroeconomics. Please help me welcome Professor Christopher Ragan. Before I hand the floor to Professor Dickinson, I must remind everyone that all the ideas discussed tonight shall be equally respected. Any disturbances to the event that you might cause might lead you to being removed. So please be respectful, and the floor is now yours, Professor Dickinson. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of us all, thank you for inviting us, and we hope that you feel as well about it at the end. The structure is going to be with 4 sets of topics: environmental policy, international trade and trade agreements, central bank policy, and government spending in Canada. These 2 discussants here are going to be restricted to 2 minutes time each to make their presentations on each question. Then they will have a 1-minute rebuttal. There's going to be a loud bell at my microphone going off when you hit your 2 minutes, gentlemen. A couple of aspects. So you think about Professor Velk here. He's been here when the Roddick Gates were built. Paul?
Speak closer to the microphone. I think they can't hear that.
Is that better? Okay. At the end of the day, at the end of the lecture, we're going to auction off Tom's signature bow tie for charity. We figured we'd auction off Tom, but doubted if the demand would be sufficient. So. Oh, well.
Closer.
This young upstart on my right here, your left, I'm told he called me avuncular the other day, so I looked it up in the Urban Dictionary. And it said, when a man develops an air of such utter harmlessness that he is no longer attractive to women. Now, Chris doesn't yet know how hard he's going to pay for that. Okay, we're going to start off then with environmental policy. As you know, Chris is the chair of the and founder of the Canada Eco-Fiscal Commission. So the first question I'll direct to him, then Tom will take over after that, after the 2 minutes. So the first one is, I want you to ignore any broader effects on the economy initially, and ask you simply, do you think that carbon pricing will be effective at reducing greenhouse gases?
And I've got 2 minutes. Is that the rules of the game? Okay, so my answer is yes, but not immediately. So the logic of carbon pricing is that markets, it's based on the idea that markets work pretty well, that prices actually allocate resources. It goes way back to the day of Adam Smith, when scarcity is reflected by higher relative prices and abundance is reflected by lower relative prices. And as prices adjust in the economy, resources flow: labor, financial capital, entrepreneurial skill, whatever. So the basic logic of carbon pricing is that if you put a price on greenhouse gas emissions, currently there's no price on greenhouse gas emissions in most places. If you put a price on greenhouse gas emissions, then you are creating a financial penalty associated with doing whatever it is that emits greenhouse gases. So by changing those prices, you are going to change behavior. So people will be led to drive differently, heat their homes differently, produce steel differently, produce anything differently. You will switch away from high carbon techniques toward low carbon techniques. We will all, as consumers, switch away from high carbon goods and services toward lower carbon goods and services. Most of that adjustment will take place over time. Nobody should be expecting carbon pricing this year to lead to big reductions in GHG emissions this year. But over time, over 2 years, over 10 years, over 25 years, these kinds of changes can be enormous. Just think about how people have moved toward much smaller cars, for example. Before you were born, we had an OPEC oil crisis that drove up the price of oil and gasoline by 200 or 300%, and in short order, we had very small, much more fuel-efficient cars that appeared on the scene. Those kinds of changes take place, but they take place over time. And the final comment would be carbon pricing is probably the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That's your signal, Christopher. Okay, Tom.
Well, the argument here is really, if you go down to fundamentals where I want to go, is the notion about climate change and global warming and so on, which for me is a form of religion that doesn't have much argument in its support. It may very well be that increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere makes it a better world. If we stop burning a ton of coal or a 55-gallon barrel of oil, it might very well mean 100 pounds less of milk for some hungry baby someplace, 500 pounds less rice for some hungry family someplace. It might mean an inability to fly an airplane to a new job that is opening up for you, all in the name of a supposed benefit that's 100 years distant. How much do you think we should spend in order to save $100 worth of costs that are 100 years distant? Somebody give me a number. How much do you think it's worth in outlays right now? Because the schemers who want to peddle this carbon tax at you want to spend many, many, many billions, even trillions of dollars in this, as I said, this religion that to which I am not an adherent. Somebody give me a number. How much is it worth? I'll give you the answer. It's 12 cents, but 12 cents on $100. As a matter of fact, that those distant claims of damage 100 years from now are made with I think anyhow, the worst kinds of economic analysis. Who would have known 100 years in the past what kind of technological tricks are available to us today to raise wheat or rice or corn or to move people around? There is no defense for the level of expenditure that the
That's
green
it,
weenies
Tom.
want
You're
to force us to absorb.
You're out. Okay, gentlemen, given the radically different views here, I don't think there's much point in having rejoined us on this one. So we'll skip to the second question if you agree.
I'd like to go for the 1 minute rejoinder.
Okay.
Is that our normal format? We're going to have a
Yep,
1 minute rejoinder?
1 minute rejoinder.
So in my 1 minute, I would say, let's note that Tom didn't answer the question. So the question was, is a carbon price good at reducing emissions? The question was not, do you believe that climate change is real and that it is deserving of a policy response? His was a, I would argue, poor answer to the question that was not asked. So let me just say this. I am not a climate scientist. To my knowledge, Tom is not a climate scientist. And so I do not actually enter into a discussion about whether the climate science is real or not. My starting point, and the starting point of the Ecofiscal Commission, and the starting point of most economists, by the way, on this issue, is that we take the climate science for which there's an overwhelming consensus. And you could argue about whether it's 80% or 85 or 90 or 95, but a consensus among the climate scientists globally that climate change is a real phenomenon, that it is driven largely by human activity, and that there are serious costs associated with it. So I start from there and then try to figure out the best way to reduce emissions, and the answer is a carbon price.
Do you want to go on that one, Tom?
The carbon price that would be necessary is one that would be adopted universally by all kinds of countries that have no interest in or belief in the green weenieism that is at the bottom of all of this. The only reason that this carbon price strategy is being discussed at all is because there is at bottom this claim that climate change is caused by humankind, that is universally a bad thing. I mean, just for example, nations are real things. Canada is a nation. Canada should have no interest at all in preventing climate change if it is happening, because it would benefit us enormously. Our tillable lands would move forward, maybe 100 miles up into the north, maybe 200, who knows, 300 miles, if all of those fantasies about climate change were true. And our yields would be greatly increased. So we should benefit, if we believe in climate change, you ought to have subsidies for carbon output, not taxes here in Canada at least.
Thank you, sir. Okay, now to the next question. If you can restrict your answers on this to the domestic economy, I'd like to ask, should we be afraid that a carbon tax will hurt Canadian output and employment in the near future and our economic growth in the longer term? Since Chris had the last one to start with, Tom, would you like to go?
Give me the question again.
Should we be afraid that a carbon tax will hurt Canadian output and employment in the near future?
We shouldn't be
and
afraid.
our
It's
economic
it's
growth
a certainty.
in the long term.
It's a tax on output. It's a tax on economic activity. It's a tax, as I said, on that, whatever it is, that 500 pounds of rice that you get when you burn a ton of coal, or those 100 gallons of milk that you get, or the trip that you can take to get your job interview. It's a tax on economic activity. The reason I think of the whole argumentation here as a kind of religion is because it bears the hallmarks of all fanatical religions that mankind has been victimized by. That is to say, it's the enemy here is wealth. The enemy here is materialism. The enemy here is we have too much stuff. We should have less of it, and we should, in this particular case, worship, I guess, Gaia, Mother Earth, or something of that kind, or green dreams of, I don't know, that the fawns bouncing through the meadows with the butterflies and so on. The real problems in places like China and India and so on where these kinds of activities would really have a murderous effect, and I mean murderous effect in the sense that people will be dead because they're not going to have enough food, they're not going to have enough transportation equipment, they're not going to have enough medicine and so on, and that's why places like that are, quote, dirty, unquote. It's because they quite rationally make the decision that maybe their air might be a little dirtier, but their people will have full bellies. And that's the real trade-off we're talking about, and that's a trade-off that I certainly would not support, especially for the poor people of the world. I yield my time, as they say in the American Congress, to my friend and colleague across the way here.
So I think part of what Tom said is right. If we put a carbon price or a carbon tax in place, and that's all we did, it wouldn't be exactly a tax on output, but it would be kind of spiritually like a tax on output, because most output, or at least output of goods as opposed to services, is produced with a lot of energy, and energy tends to rely a lot on the production and the generation of greenhouse gas emissions. So if you just did a tax on carbon, you would actually impact, GDP or income and wealth in a negative way, for sure. But any, I would argue, sensible economic approach to carbon pricing, and what the Ecofiscal Commission is devoted to, is thinking about policies that improve the economy and the environment at the same time. So a sensible approach to carbon pricing would be to put on a carbon tax of $30 per ton, or 50 or 70 or 90 or whatever, but with every dollar of the revenue, use the revenue to reduce existing other more distortionary taxes. Tom Velk will be the first to tell you why income taxes, and in particular corporate income taxes, generate a drag on growth. He would probably agree that there's probably no worse tax that we've ever created that's more growth retarding than a corporate income tax. I don't know if you want to nod. He nods
of course,
toward
right.
that. Look at that. So if you could take all of the revenue from a carbon price and reduce existing more distortionary taxes, you could actually improve the economic growth, and you could actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. Final word, we've done some modeling at the Ecofiscal Commission exactly on that point, and the short-run impact, by short run I mean 10 to 12 years, impact on economic growth from carbon pricing, a serious carbon price, and tax reductions is basically a wash. Better environment, no impact on growth.
Yeah, I take my, whatever it is that I get. A minute, good. The point is, if things worked the way my friend says they would work, that would be fine, but they don't work that way. Political reality is that if the bureaucrats get more money, they're going to use it to buy votes. The best way to buy a vote is with another welfare program, another scheme, another giveaway. They're not going to do it. If we've learned anything from the growth of government that's occurred, since the time of Adam and Eve, we have learned that politicians use the public's money, your parents' money, the money you hope to get when you get out of this place and get a real job, is to buy the votes, especially to buy the votes of those folks who have them for sale. And the folks who have them for sale are not the productive members of society, alas. So the realistic consequence of this enormous inflow of funds that would occur to the bureaucrats and the governments of the world.
Thank you, Chris.
With a
Thank you,
carbon
Tom.
tax will be, that money will be misspent, not in the sensible way that my friend suggests.
I agree with Tom that we should be concerned about how our governments spend this revenue, absolutely, and that we should hold them to account. I am not yet so jaundiced in my view of humanity that I think that there's no hope for governments, although perhaps I will get there. But one of the reasons why I continue to be optimistic about the ability of governments to do good policy is that every once in a while you see it. So in 2008, Gordon Campbell, who was a small c conservative, large L liberal premier of British Columbia, introduced a revenue neutral, legislatively guaranteed to be revenue neutral carbon tax. The carbon tax in BC today is $30 a ton. It generates $1.2 million. They now have the lowest, or among the lowest, personal and corporate income taxes in the country. Revenue neutral, it can be done.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to move on a little now. That was to do with the domestic economy. Of course, the international economy is extremely important to Canada. And since Professor Ragan is founder of the Eco-Fiscal Commission, I'm going to take a quotation from him. And that quotation says, "The risk is that the carbon price at home may increase costs enough that some home businesses could lose market share to their foreign rivals." So I'd like each of you to comment on this risk, and particularly in the light of the anti-interventionist stance of President Trump. Which one you want to go first? Who wants?
You pick, you're the boss.
Okay, go, Chris.
So this is the issue of how carbon pricing impacts the competitiveness or challenges the competitiveness of the business sector is a really important idea. The other idea is what it does to the impact on households and whether it's a fair impact, especially on the low-income households. So these are really important issues that have to be dealt with, and I think if you were to just put a carbon price in place and not worry about this, you would be in big, big trouble. It's interesting that the Alberta government that put a carbon tax in place that started 2 months ago, and the Ontario government that put a cap and trade in place that started 2 months ago, both of these governments are very aware of the competitiveness issue, and they are designing their policies. They both did kind of slightly different things, but they're dealing with the competitiveness challenge, and it's particularly a challenge in those sectors that are emissions intensive and very trade exposed. They're selling into global markets with very little price setting power. So you're producing cement, you're producing fertilizer, you're refining, you're bitumen upgrading, you're producing lime, you're producing steel, the aluminum in this province. These are sectors that are particularly carbon intensive and they're particularly exposed, but you absolutely can deal with this. The election of President Trump in the United States changes the political rhetoric and dynamic significantly. I have to admit that for sure. But it doesn't change the fundamental issue that this was always going to be a problem in Canada, is that when we put a carbon price in place last year, the United States was not on the verge of having nationwide carbon pricing on November 7th, and it certainly isn't today. So competitiveness and maintaining the competitiveness of the Canadian economy was always going to be important. It still is important, and if you would design the policy in a good way, as the Alberta and Ontario governments are doing approximately, you can actually solve this problem.
Thanks, Chris. Tom?
As my old grandpa would have put it, the importance of Canada to the rest of the world's economy is like a fart in a hurricane. We don't really, if anybody can't hear me back there, the day comes I can't fill a hall like this without a microphone. I might as well quit at my job. I can fill this hall very easily and not use this damn thing whatsoever. I could save a lot of carbon, right? So don't worry about
There's no
my
carbon.
microphone.
This electricity is completely clean.
And you've just used up half a minute.
That's all right. It was well worth. The laugh was worth it. I'm an entertainer as much as anything else, I think, and I am not ashamed of it. You make more points with sugar than with salt, I guess, or something like that. Takes a spoonful of sugar to let the medicine go down. I'm
Would you
using
like
more
me
of
to
my
repeat the
time.
question?
The point is, we're not important enough to force the rest of the world to accept our views either on the importance of global warming or on the value of carbon pricing. We will certainly price ourselves out of many markets, and in addition, there are many societies that have a completely reversed view. As I said in the first place, China, India, places like that are plenty willing to accept even the absurd costs that are claimed for global warming. They're running, and it makes sense for them not to do what we are doing, so we would even further price ourselves out, because if anything, they'll give subsidies to, as they do, to folks who are energy using industries.
I think it's worth noting that China is in the process of designing a nationwide carbon price.
They're saying they're going to do it. We'll see
Oh,
if they
they've
do
all,
it.
there are 7 cities that total 85 million people that currently have it. So,
That's fine. Yeah, how many other cities
I'm-
are there that
I'm-
they're not using? I think there are more than
They're
7
coming.
cities in China.
Hold it,
They're
guys.
coming.
Hold it. I'm not
Am I
sure.
right about that?
I'm not sure whether we've had a
Chinese
rejoinder or
students?
not
No,
here.
we're done. We're done.
You're done? Are you done?
I'm done.
Okay. That's good. Okay. All right. Okay. We're going to move on now to a little more international trade stuff. Let me just see what I've got down here for me that I wrote. Ah, yes. Now, being economists, likely both of you are in favor of free trade, so just correct me if I'm wrong. But the question is whether you have similarly positive views on international trade agreements. And I'm going to give you a couple of quotations from Professor Velk here. In 2011, trade makes everybody better off. It is an economic axiom. Even if the rich get richer by trade, the poor get richer too, as long as trade is voluntary. Relevant to the question. Professor Ragan has said the Trans-Pacific Partnership would call Canada to task on its supply management systems. These are systems it has on milk and eggs, etc., to prevent imports and to raise the incomes of farmers, which doesn't. Anyway, we are hypocritical, Professor Ragan says. So the first is a broad question. Do you think trade agreements like TPP, NAFTA, and CETA help to achieve the goals of free trade? And what concerns you most about them? Tom, would you please start this one?
I said earlier that nations are real things. Really, they have a real political and social and cultural existence. We put lines around ourselves that are defined by culture and religion and language and ideas. And when we negotiate across those lines, we are not interested in practicing free trade as it would be in the textbook. Free trade as it is in the textbook means that you don't have a tariff between the east side of Montreal and the west side of Montreal. But political reality is such that trade agreements have nothing to do with the textbook model where it's easy to show that the pie gets bigger. Even in the classroom, I take pains to drag my students through the hexaroline process. I take pains to drag them through the optimum currency ideas. Those are fancy ways of making the point that a pie getting bigger is not relevant to somebody who is interested in maximizing their chunk of the pie. And that's what all traders are really involved in doing. So NAFTA, for example, protects our insanely inefficient CBC, our inefficient milk producers, inefficient pork producers, not the pork chicken producers, I mean to say, and a number of other of our inefficiencies. Some of the worst inefficiencies, as a matter of fact, tend to be the most heavily protected in real trade negotiations. And that is what gives us the enmity that Mr. Trump has shown to TPP and even to the North American trade relationships that are so important to Canada. It is a matter of political judgment. It's a matter of circumstances, as the great Edmund Burke says, whether any particular trade negotiation or agreement is worth having or worth conducting.
Thank you, Tom. Chris?
When I talk about trade in my classes, I talk about, and this is a classic exam question for me, so the quote would be something like, free trade is about benefits for all, but costs for some, unquote, explain, okay? Benefits for all, but costs for some. The benefits for all come from kind of the textbook logic of free trade, that it's good if Canada and Europe engage in trade and we end up producing more of the stuff that we're good at and less of the stuff that we're not very good at, and they do the reverse, and we trade and there's benefits. And you're increasing the overall size of both pies. The costs for some come from the fact that the process of moving from less trade to more trade involves real resource shifts. So people get laid off in one sector, and it takes them a while before they move to the other sector, or it takes them a while to retrain before they can find a job in the other sector. And those are real costs. Economists tend to think about them as transitional costs. And if you're a 32-year-old and you get laid off in the auto sector, you probably get reabsorbed in an expanding clean tech sector pretty quickly. But if you're 55 years old and you get laid off, maybe retraining's not going to happen. Maybe it's going to be a while before you get reabsorbed. Maybe you're not going to get reabsorbed at all. So there are genuine costs that come with the adjustment toward freer trade, and I think we have to pay attention to them. And I would argue that in most cases we probably haven't paid enough attention to them, although it is very difficult to identify people who have lost their job because of free trade rather than somebody that has lost their job for any one of a number of reasons. It is a practical difficulty. The final thing I would say is the nature of trade is changing and has changed over years. It's going away from just greater trade in goods and services and more to trade in funky services where intellectual property plays a very important role. And these trade agreements are often now directed at protecting intellectual property so that we can protect the incentives to generate that intellectual property. Overall, trade is good, but we got to do it carefully.
Rejoinder, Tom?
Well, I agree with what he said. The story that I give my kids in class is the famous one, wine and cloth, England and Portugal. England makes great cloth, lousy wine. Portugal makes great wine, lousy cloth. After trade gets going, the Englishmen don't make any bad wine anymore. All the wine is made by the very excellent winemakers in Portugal, and wine drinkers are better off. And likewise for Portuguese cloth, nobody will wear it because it itches you to death. You get all your good cloth from the Englishmen. But the trouble is Portuguese cloth makers are out of business, as are English winemakers, and you have to deal with them politically and realistically. That's what trade negotiations are all about. And the current situation, for example, the factor pricing story that I'm sure Chris tells his students as I tell mine.
Can you round it off, Tom? Your time's up, mate.
Okay. Ordinary workers here in the West have suffered because of East-West trade, while our bosses, if you want to put it that way, because they're very good at organization, have benefited. It hooks up with this idea of increasing inequalities.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. Chris?
I don't have a rejoinder, so you can have my minute.
Oh, go ahead, mate.
Well, thanks. That is to say, the trade is associated with this leftist guy that I don't like very much, who has promoted the idea that the rich are getting richer here in the West and the poor are getting poorer. There's some truth in that. As a matter of fact, it is happening. The other side of it is that on a planetary-wide basis, the poor are getting richer in the East, and the former bosses, at least the people at the level of Mao Zedong and such, are no longer there. And it's our managers who are managing, or our managerial style that they have imported. So their income differences are shrinking. Planetary-wide, trade is, in that sense, a wonderful thing. It's made inequality much less planet-wide. But nobody is the government of all the people, of all the planet. As Trump very wisely said in one of his recent remarks, he's the president of the USA, not the world. We don't have a president of the world. We'll never will have one. And the logic of free trade depends on somebody thinking in terms of the planet, and nobody thinks that way, and they never will.
Thanks, Tom. Okay. The President Trump, he's adamant that NAFTA is to be renegotiated to the benefit of the U.S. Canada is the U.S.'s second largest goods trader, after a trading partner with the U.S. after China. Just some details: in 2015, Canada exported $295 billion worth of goods to the U.S., and the US imported 280 billion from Canada, which is together is almost 600 billion in the total two-way goods trade. And if you add services to that, perhaps you could double the number. So my question is the following, that given this interplay, this huge interdependency here, does Canada really have a lot to fear from a renegotiated NAFTA? Chris, your turn first, I think, isn't it?
So my snappy answer is yes, we have some to fear, but we shouldn't overstate it. One concern I have, and I would have the same concern if I were American, is that President Trump appears to think that trade is a zero-sum game. He tends to, this is based on kind of 2 months of watching him as president and, 20 years before that of trying to ignore him. But looking at 2 months as president, it appears that he thinks that, things are about a deal. Deal making is his forte. And he appears to think that international trade is a zero-sum game. And by that I mean, something that's a good deal for America is a bad deal for Canada and vice versa. The logic of trade is that it's a positive sum game, that it's actually, and exactly the Portuguese and English example with wine and cloth was exactly that both countries gain when you actually stick to producing what you're good at and import from the other country what they're particularly good at. Both countries gain. So what that means is that we have some bargaining power, as a country always does with another country, because we actually do some things very well that the United States benefits from. We export all of our natural gas to the United States. Now, their production has increased already dramatically in the last few years, but they still buy ours, and they still want ours. They buy almost all of our oil, and they still want it. They buy all of our, or huge amounts of our softwood lumber. They have tremendously integrated automobile industry with ours, with parts going back and forth and getting kind of more refined before they get installed. So there are huge benefits the United States is currently getting from trade with Canada and indeed with trade from other countries. Now, so I think Canada has some bargaining power. That being said, we are a small country. Trade with the United States for us is much bigger in our world as a percentage of total than trade with us is for them. So we are small, but we are not zero, and we have to play our cards carefully.
Tom?
Good. I have some fun defending my man, Trump. I'm a Republican. I carry a knife. I've been smoking cigars since I was 12. I drink rye whiskey, and my brother's a Marine. You're always a Marine, by the way, even though he's in his 70s. But, as I said, you're always no. Once you're a Marine, my friend, you're always a Marine. If there's some Americans out there, you know what I'm talking about. The point is, maybe I have a small difference with my friend. I think Trump is very much a trader. What he's going to do, though, is he's going to be a two-way trader. He's going to take country by country, and when he can, he's going to push them up against the wall and say, listen, this is what I want, better give it to me, or I can hurt you bad. And he's going to move away from multilateral trade agreements, such as TPP and so on, because it gives a chance for his many opponents to gang up on him, and he's not going to give them that chance. I think he recognizes the points that were just made about the importance of what I would call the integrated North American economy. I used to be, as I said, I still am very much connected with North American studies. And North America is a natural economic market. The border shouldn't really be there in economic terms, and it isn't, in fact. And one of the great things that happened with NAFTA was that the border got a lot less important in terms of the integration of firms, so the automobile industry, the building industry, and so on. And that's what made it a lot easier to sell. You didn't have so many winners and losers as you would have with the wine and the cloth case. It makes it easy to show that really everybody benefits, very few losers, when you can just improve the efficiency of a whole industry, as in the case of, say, automobile trade relationships. But Canada will not any longer have the benefit of being as specially treated as it has been in the past, because Trump will not is going to be the president of the USA, not North America, unfortunately for us.
Rejoinder, Christopher.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever been a U.S. president who didn't have U.S. interests at heart. And so my interpretation of, Ronald Reagan's support of the FTA and George Bush's support of NAFTA is that they actually thought it was in America's interest to actually trade more within North America. And, the support of TPP or other trade agreements, and the WTO for that matter, is the belief that America gains by having greater trade flows among all countries. So I think it is absolutely true what Tom said, that President Trump is very likely to engage in one-on-one negotiations because he thinks, and he's probably right, that he has more bargaining power one by one than he does in a group. What I fear, though, is that his fundamental view of trade is mistaken, that his fundamental view of trade is as zero-sum. If you listen to his advisor, Peter Navarro, on trade,
You round it off, Chris.
I think most of what Navarro says is outright false. And violates most of what we take to be kind of Economics 101.
Thank you,
and I'm
sir.
not yet to the point where I'm prepared to concede that Economics 101
Thank
or
you.
208 is wrong.
Tom?
The relationship that was built by Reagan and Bush and so on was essentially multilateral. It wasn't it wasn't that multi. There was just Mexico and Canada, of course. But Trump is going to pick countries off one at a time. I don't think I don't know about his advisors, but I don't think that Trump at all has this zero-sum game view, but he has very much the view that he doesn't care if the pie gets smaller. He cares about what we might call optimum currency area type theory. He cares about second best type theory. He cares about how much America gets out of a relationship. So in some senses, he may even at sometimes be less than zero-sum. He might be quite interested in the planetary pie getting even smaller than it is now. But if he can get something that he can take home to his voters, you can bet your bippy that he's going to do it.
Thank you.
And that's
can you just
precisely the
please-
danger.
Could you
Canada.
just both
And I agree.
please, very briefly, sort of summarize your position, your view on, does this level of interdependency help us with the renegotiation, and do we have a lot to fear from it? Very briefly, because there's a different viewpoint here.
Well, as I said, negotiation with Trump is going to be a very serious matter, and if he sees a chance to get something away from us, if you want to put it that way, he will take it. And we are going to have less than we have had in the past, but to defend ourselves in the sense that we won't have, say, Mexico to stick out there and say, help me, Mr. Mexico, fight this guy off. We're not.
So,
we're gonna
so
do
we
it
have
one
a
at
lot
beat.
to fear because of the
We
power
have something to
of
fear.
the state.
Yeah, we have something to fear.
Chris?
I think Canadians have been, Canadians have been negotiating trade agreements multilaterally, bilaterally, and in WTO for many, many years. And they've been doing it very well. We've got very smart, well-trained, experienced negotiators. I think what we have to do is recalibrate our approach for the Trump approach that I think Tom described very well. Trump is not an internationalist. Ronald Reagan actually might have been. George Bush absolutely was. Barack Obama was an internationalist. Donald Trump absolutely is not. So he is about me, or us, as the U.S. We are going to be interested in our interests, but we are also internationalists for the most part, and we are going to be interested in global things. So we have to recalibrate, but I am absolutely confident that we will do well in these negotiations because we're good at them.
We'll do better than Mexico will do it, for sure.
Thank you both. Okay, we're now going to move away from the trade issue and start looking at the central banks and bank policies. So my first question may elicit a single word answer from each, or just may expose some very stark differences. So the first simple question is, are you in favor of having central banks? Tom?
Well, you know, I'm a political realist, but when they make me emperor, I will get rid of the central banks. Yes, for the very simple historical reason that since the time of central banking, the beginning of the end of the 19th and through the 20th century, we have had experience with inflation such of a kind and a danger that was never experienced in the world before, because there wasn't a chance to make paper money to the degree, and for governments to borrow to the degree that they can now borrow. Central banks, as David Hume observed in the 18th century, or banking controlled by government, has the danger of allowing governments to borrow irresponsibly with paper money, with easy interest rates. They've done that. We have had, I think, the Peter Temin number, inflation in Hungary in the 1920s and 30s was order of magnitude 10 to the 26th. I forget if that was a Temin number, or maybe you'll remember it was somebody. In any case, there are currently an enormously dangerous situation of what's called asset price inflation that's going on because of, I was supposed to do this in one word, wasn't I? Sorry.
We're going to come to
I ran off.
We're going to come to the asset price inflation.
Don't go there yet.
Okay, we're going to do asset price. I'll let my
We're
friend,
coming there.
I'll give I yield my time to my colleague.
Thank you, Tom. That sure wasn't the one-word answer, so there must be
No,
some
I
stark
forgot.
differences. Christopher?
My answer is yes, I believe in central banks as long as they are well run. And just in a couple of sentences, I would say, while there have been lots of bumps and wiggles and good times and bad times with central banks as we now know them in the past 75 years, I think central banks actually have learned a lot, and policy has improved dramatically. And I would argue that since the early 1990s, when many of your favorite central banks have adopted inflation targeting, that has provided a tremendous amount of discipline that Tom was talking about central banks not having in earlier years. And I think, I don't think central banks are perfect by any means, but I think the period from 1991, give or take, to 2008 actually showed central banks operating very successfully, largely to inflation targets, keeping inflation low and stable. And I would argue in the presence of or confronted with the financial crisis, I think they also responded very well, but I'll stop there because that will get us into our next question. So yes, I'm in favor of good and well-run central banks.
Do you want to rejoin it?
Yeah,
Can we just go straight
well,
to the next
maybe
question?
I'll move us over into asset
Can
price
I ask the
inflation.
question on that, Tom, and hold?
Well, you ask your
Yep.
question. I'll answer the way I'm going to answer anyhow, but you ask the question.
I know. the people out here should know what you're answering. So,
The same answer.
again, the next one is about quantitative easing, which refers to the large-scale purchases of the private sector assets by the central bank, and they use freshly created money to do it.
And public assets. Lots of government bonds in there too.
And sorry, my apologies, public assets as well. It's intended to stimulate the economy. In the process, it raises asset prices, lowers interest rates, and weakens the exchange rate to stimulate exports. Many economists are concerned about interest rates being, quotes, too low for too long. And very low interest rates do add fuel to unsustainable prices of real estate and financial assets, etc. So the question is, looking at what central banks have done here with quantitative easing, what's your position on this?
Quantitative easing is a very dangerous practice. The Federal Reserve System in the U.S. was founded in 1913. Between 1913 and 2008, the assets that comprise the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve went from 0 to $0.8 trillion. That is to say, since the amount of the size of the central bank's balance sheet is a measure of how much money they have created, between 1913 and 2008, the central bank, the U.S., created $0.8 trillion worth of money. Between 2008 and right now, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is approximately $5 trillion. They increased from 0.8 by $4.2 trillion worth of, that was new money. How did it get out there? The Fed bought crap. They bought bad mortgages. They bought bad debt from governments that no one else would buy. That's why the Fed had to buy it. Where did the money go? The money, luckily for the Americans, because the U.S. dollar is an international medium of exchange, the money flew all over the world to support sometimes some economic activity, but essentially it supported an enormous increase in the value of tradable assets and stock exchanges. You can buy a Ferrari now if you have $160 million for a particularly valuable old Ferrari. Old master paintings, not just old master paintings and Ferraris, but stocks and bonds. And the low interest rate and the short run point of view caused people to, caused asset allocation, financial allocation of investable assets to move, first of all, from the long end of the market to the short end, and then it encouraged in those short investments for those investments to be highly speculative, to the money to hop from the stock market to the commodities market, to the currency market, back to the stock market in a very dangerous way that did not produce long-run growth, but instead misallocated investable assets to an enormous and dangerous degree around the world.
Thank you, Professor Velk. Professor Ragan.
I think the best way to think about quantitative easing is to imagine what would have happened had it not occurred. So this is a very difficult counterfactual to run. But Ben Bernanke, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve in 2008, is also and was also a specialist. His professional specialty is the financial crises and the banking problems and the economic problems that happened during the Great Depression. And so what he knew better than most people is that in the 1930s, when the Federal Reserve didn't step in to prevent banks from failing, what we had in the United States was thousands of banks failing. They have a very different banking system than ours, which amounts to an enormous monetary contraction. So we had banks failing, a monetary contraction that contributed to, it wasn't the only cause, but it contributed to the deepening of and the creation of the Great Depression. From 1929 to 1932, GDP in the United States fell by 30%. The price level fell by 30%. Unemployment went up to 25%. Massive, massive economic tragedy. Ben Bernanke was interested in preventing that in 2008. He was not going to sit by and let banks fail by the thousands, let a massive monetary contraction happen, and let the Great Depression happen again in 2008. Quantitative easing was his response to a central bank situation that had brought the policy interest rate down to basically zero, and the economy was still in bad shape, and he said, all right, we are going to do more. So not only was fiscal policy brought in, and we'll talk about that in the next set, fiscal policy was brought in the United States and all of the G20 countries, but monetary policy in the United States went into even more expansionary mode by printing money, as central banks always do, and buying, as Tom said, a quintupling of the balance sheet. So I hope we have a couple of rejoinders on this, because there's more to talk about why this is a good idea, but also why there are problems associated with it.
Thank you, Chris. Tom, you got the rejoinder?
Yeah. Since the quantitative easing idea took hold, the growth rate in the U.S. Coming out of a recession has been notoriously as low as it has ever been coming out of a recession. It averages, I don't know, maybe 1.5%, maybe 1.7% per annum, somewhere in that neighborhood, instead of 3% or 4%, which is the sort of rate that you would expect coming out of a recession. And in good times, as a matter of fact, in a well-managed, well-operating economy, I think you should be able to expect at least a 2.5% or a 3% steady rate of growth. I think that one of the reasons for the slow growth and for the very anemic, very unsatisfactory so-called recovery that the world has had in this current situation is largely because of quantitative easing, not just in the U.S., but around the world, all kinds of central banks, with the, I think, notable exception, more or less, of Canada. I think we ran one of the most responsible fiscal and monetary policies after 2008 in the group of 8. You add up the cost of growing at half the rate or a third of the rate that you're supposed to grow from 2008 until now,
Thanks,
and you
Tom.
get, with a $20 trillion economy, you get a very big number, and that's all lost, to my way of thinking, to quantitative easing.
Thank you, sir.
Tom is quite right that the U.S. economy and the European economy and even the Canadian economy, the recoveries post-2008-9 have been very sluggish. That's absolutely true. If you look at the work by Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff, who are two very smart people who have written an interesting book called something like This Time is Different, subtitle 8 Centuries of Financial Folly, there's lots of data in there to suggest that recoveries following financial crises are notoriously slow. And it's because following financial crises, you've got banks and corporations and households who are deleveraging. They are getting out of debt. And one of the things they're not doing is expanding aggregate demand through borrowing and spending. So there's just a massive contraction or slow recovery to aggregate demand and to credit and to leverage, which is a natural response to over leverage and over debt. And there's kind of panic when the crisis first happens, and then it's followed by this very sluggish lack of confidence deleveraging.
Thank you,
But
Chris.
I would argue that in the absence of the quantitative easing, things would have been much more like the 1930s and much less like what we have witnessed.
Thank you. Because of the depth of what you said there, I'm going to skip a question and go into something else. Back in 2008, you saw the high asset prices that really crashed in 2008. And so I'm going to ask, what role do you think that financial regulation had in that crash? Have sufficient measures been taken to decrease the likelihood of a similar crisis happening in the near future because of what's happening with stock market prices, housing market prices, etc.? Chris, why don't you go first on that?
If you take my class in 319 called Financial Crises or Economic Crises or whatever it's called, but it's about economic and financial crises, one of the things we do is we get to the end of the course and I ask the question, okay, so who do you want to blame for the financial crisis? And the answer is, I think the right answer is there's all kinds of blame to go around all kinds of places. You can blame the Federal Reserve for being excessively stimulative. You can blame predatory mortgage lending. You can blame stupid individuals for borrowing too much money to buy too big a house when they don't really have a job. You can blame excessive financial market regulation. You can blame inappropriate financial market deregulation. You can blame the U.S. tax code because we have mortgage tax deductibility. You can blame credit rating agencies. There's all kinds of blame to go around. So if the question is only about financial market regulation and deregulation, I think the answer is, well, we're working on it. Many countries are, the Basel process, the Basel III process has recommended financial market regulatory changes. It is up to each individual country to do those. Countries are in the various states of re-regulating or changing the regulations that their banks face, very often making them have higher capital ratios, which is probably a good idea as long as you don't go too far. If you read John Kenneth Galbraith on financial euphoria, which is a great little book, A Short History of Financial Euphoria, his view is that it's kind of the nature of the system that we have these periods of financial euphoria. We have asset price run-ups. based on optimism, based on bits of insanity. And then you actually have a crash and panic, and then the deleveraging, and you have these ugly times. And you can probably reduce the likelihood that these things happen through parts of regulation and re-regulation and better regulation, not just more. But also we should just probably accept that a capitalist system full of humans who are full of human frailties, probably, this is probably just the nature of the beast.
Thank you, Chris. Please understand that only some humans have frailties. Tom.
My students, I think there's some of them out there, remember having to read what I call the Green Book in class, the Recent Innovations in International Banking, the BIS publication, Bank for International Settlements. That publication is the progenitor, to use a fancy word, of the Basel Rules. The Basel Rules are one of the examples of, I think, the cause. The cause is, I don't know what you might call it, the arrogance of financial regulators or the cupidity of politicians who disguise their acts of regulation when they are really attempts at the usual thing that politicians like to do best of all is buy votes. In any case, the Basel Rules are one of the causes. Basel Rules, certainly as they were first promulgated in Basel I, said that the best thing for banks to do was to lend money to governments. And Basel I was, I think, one of the most important regulatory errors that gave rise to the enormous increase in government borrowing that has gone around the world since the time of Basel I in the 80s and 90s, and allowed bankers to drop their usual caution about lending to politicians who are busy, as I said, buying votes with the money. The second great big thing that happened in the U.S., again, its roots go back to the 70s and 80s, is what was called the Community Reinvestment Act, a piece of legislation started by LBJ, aggravated by Carter, by Clinton, and made really infamous by Obama, which forced the American banking system to lend money to ninjas, no job, no income, no assets, as again, to my way of thinking, just a naked way of buying votes from folks who could get houses for nothing. But anyhow, the regulatory apparatus encourages bad lending because it encourages government-supported projects and politically correct projects rather than productive projects.
Thanks, Tom. Rejoinder, Chris?
No, finish your thought, and then I'll
Okay.
do it. You go into your rejoinder now. Just continue your thought.
Okay. And what I'm saying, in other words, is that the regulatory process impedes bankers who are, I think, if left alone, wise enough to avoid excessive lending to governments and to avoid politically correct lending in favor of looking after their stockholders and their depositors, because the bank, not that the bankers are so generous-minded, but they want to keep their jobs. They are now so beholden to the regulatory process and so jerked around by it, and that regulatory process encourages such a degree of political element in the asset allocation process that we, as I said, have reduced the whole of the G7 to a lower growth rate future than would otherwise be the case if asset allocation was conducted on a profit-maximizing basis rather than a politically correct basis.
I think there's a real danger in talking about regulations as if they are all the same and a regulatory process as if there is only one. So there are all kinds of regulations out there in financial markets and labor markets and pension systems and food systems. There are all kinds of regulations that are perfectly sensible. There are also all kinds of regulations that are probably not sensible. And I think the challenge is to think about the regulations that we have and the regulations that we need, and then how to get from what we have to what we need. And that involves introducing new regulations, it involves reforming regulations into a better form, and it involves repealing and getting rid of some regulations. And the challenge then to figure out, I mean, it's easy to see what we have because you look at the books and you say what we have. But determining what we need is actually quite challenging. And you've got to determine, well, what we need for whom? Like, whose life are we trying to make better? And I think determining kind of the optimal set of regulations in the financial sector or in the labor market or in the food system is very, very challenging. And you've got to think about it on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Chris. We've just got a little assessment to do. I've done another set of questions on government spending, the big budget deficit with infrastructure and also the growing needs of the funding the healthcare system as some baby boomers on my right and left I get older. But Omar Gordon, I believe you have asked for questions from the floor that you have some, so I'm going to leave it up to you. Do you want us to continue, or would you like to do those questions? Up to you, your choice.
One more set, good.
Okay.
This is a good set.
Because you've only got 10 minutes left of your own time, remember.
So we'll be snappy. Tom, we're going to be snappy.
Snap, snap.
Okay.
1 minute each.
Snap, crack,
1 minute
that's
each, you
me.
got it.
Right
1 minute
stick.
each.
Trudeau government's annual budget was projected at 10 billion for this year. That estimate's now gone to 30 billion. And one cause of that projected deficit is the cost of spending on infrastructure. Both our generation and, more importantly, your future generations that are out there, your future compared to us at least, they're going to be on the hook for this national debt, for the increase in the national debt. So my question is, since the benefits of improved infrastructure are going to be felt mainly by future generations, is it not, what's the problem with letting them pay for a chunk of it? Tom?
Well, everybody should pay for what they get, and there'd be a lot less foolish government expenditure. I spend a lot of my time in the state of Vermont, a tiny little state, and they're currently tearing their garments and rending their hair because the absurdities of Obamacare have now made themselves clear to the residents of Vermont, because they were counting on the citizens of the rest of the country to pay for a lot of what they do. It's what happens here in Quebec, of course, all the time. We threaten to separate unless the rest of Canada gives us some money that doesn't come from our taxpayers, but comes from God knows where, and allows us to have a better life than we deserve to have, and a better life than we pay for. A good way to rationalize...
And keeps your tuition fees lower than they otherwise
That's right,
would be.
and a lot of you probably should not be here at all. Not because you not because you're not smart and able and so on, but you are induced to take a major in I don't know what.
Are you going to answer the question?
Art
very
history.
quickly, because we're
when
short
you
of
should
time,
be,
Tom.
when you'd make a better personal life for yourselves, learning how to be a very good carpenter, or a cabinet maker, or a plumber. You are faced with an irrational price structure. It's put to you that in these essential early years of your life, you ought to spend them drinking downstairs in Gertz or reading novels and going to the movies and calling yourself a student of cultural affairs.
I'd like to
is
give
not
you 10
rational,
seconds of
and
my
government
time
does
if you would
this
answer
all
the
time.
question.
That it-
I'd like to give you my 10 seconds
Oh,
to
you did-
answer the question.
What's the question?
10 seconds.
Give me the question. Give me the question.
The question
Any
is,
question.
if future generations are going to pay for infrastructure because we're going to do it with borrowed money, isn't that okay since they're going to get the benefits of the
getting the
infrastructure?
benefits.
If there was a real way to make future generations pay, I'd be for it, but it's impossible. Only we can pay for things we do today.
Okay, so the real question is it okay to borrow money, right, government budget deficits, to finance infrastructure, implicitly because the future generations will pay service and pay back that debt? My answer is yes, as long as the infrastructure is actually going to benefit the future generations. So infrastructure is not a simple thing. So if you're going to build stupid stuff that doesn't generate any benefits for you or for your children, then, well, I don't think we should build it at all, let alone have you pay for it. But if we're going to build infrastructure, if we're going to use borrowed money to build, I don't know, libraries in universities or hockey rinks that will get used for 40 years in your communities, or swimming pools, or better port facilities, or better highways,
Or
and
a
all
big
of those things are going to
international
generate
airport
benefits.
north of Montreal.
I have no problem borrowing money. I didn't hear that. I have no problem borrowing money
Mirabel.
to build good infrastructure, not like Mirabel. Tom and I will agree on this. Not like Mirabel. Stupid spending.
Okay.
Tom and I agree almost on everything, right? You've
Yeah,
noticed that.
look, I'm sorry
Almost
you
everything.
chose people with such similar viewpoints on these things. It's really unfortunate. Yeah. Last question I got here.
So Tom agreed on that. Tom said it
Of
was
course.
okay to make them pay, but you just don't think you can make them pay.
That's
I said it's okay to make them pay, and I think we can make them pay.
Well,
Hey, we got an
of course-
agreement.
but
Let's stop this. There's one more
Well,
thing
no,
we've got to
one
do.
very teeny point.
Teeny.
But when you borrow now, it means that you are not getting, the extra bowl of cereal in the morning because you had to forego it because those resources were used up building Mirabel. You do pay today for the infrastructure that you build today because you've made an alternative use of existing resources. I think we agree about that.
Yep.
Okay. That's, I think it's partly saying that we live longer than 10 years, so we're all generations together sometimes. Last question.
Question two. Are you going to do question two?
Okay.
Okay, you're not gonna do question two.
We're really short of time.
Okay,
so
fine. Question three.
I'm going to
That's good.
skip and go to the question 3 I gave you on the sheet there. So this has some relevance given what's going down in the States at the moment. And the baby boom is coming into the old ages now, and it's going to place more demand on the healthcare system. And some people have estimated that roughly 90% of lifetime healthcare costs occur in the last year of life. Provinces are going to be under a lot greater pressures to meet these challenges of the high costs. The federal government is in a better financial position. It's recently finalized agreements with some provinces on healthcare transfers. Now, given this whole Canadian context, how do you think we should deal with the growing financial needs of this healthcare system as the baby boom comes through?
Who? You. Well, one real hard-ass answer is to say that sick people ought to pay a hell of a lot more for their care than they do. Because if they don't pay, you all will. And it's arguable that at your stage in life, you have a much more productive opportunity to use those resources than the dying ex-economics professor Geezer, who is just going to on his breather for another couple of months at the cost of maybe the alternative use of the resources another year for you in engineering school, rather than your art history course. In the U.S., the whole business about pre-existing conditions is a good case in point. You don't insure a burning barn. You don't insure a car after you've had the accident. Looking after folks who are sick and at the end of their life or in the middle of their life who have the misfortune to have a pre-existing condition is an extremely expensive affair, and I think out of fairness and rationality, they ought to be made to pay more than they do pay now for those kinds of services. But of course, it's politically incorrect to say that, and it's politically impossible to do it. And the consequence is, I'm afraid, I have a rather dark view of what is the future for medical care around the world. It's going to be very expensive, and it's going to be irrationally distributed. The assets will be irrationally distributed to the dying and the old instead of to the young and productive.
Thanks, Tom. The question wasn't really answered as to how we should deal with the baby boom problem that's coming ahead.
Don't keep them alive, is what I'm saying.
Well, I was thinking that it seems
To
to be
the extent that we do,
in
yes.
your mind, it seems to be a trade-off between going private and euthanasia. Is that correct?
There is a real rational question. Do you devote your assets in the medical field to those folks who have very little productivity left, or do you devote them to folks who have a great deal of productivity left? And right now, we tax those folks who have the productivity left, and we give it to those folks who don't, and that is a tough question, but that's the reality of it.
Well, I question whether old people generally have low productivity, Tom, but there we go. Christopher?
Well, some old people certainly do.
Yeah.
So, I would, okay, so I think there's lots of problems with Canada's healthcare system. Many problems. So I'm all in favor of trying to improve our healthcare system. But there is a fundamental premise on which our healthcare system is based that I kind of think is a sensible premise. And the premise is we all get old. And when we get old, most of us get sick. And many of us get sick before we get old. But we generally don't know who is going to get sick and who isn't going to get sick. So it's an insurance system. We are self-insuring ourselves as a population. So we all put some money into the kitty, right? And you put more, rich people put more money into the kitty because they pay more taxes. But we all put money into the kitty, and then we say, okay, when you get sick, or when you get old, or when you get old and sick, we want to take care of you. And back to the point, we don't do everything right in this healthcare system. There's lots of inefficiencies, I have no doubt. There probably is a greater role for the private sector to play roles in particular places, which already, by the way, exists in our healthcare system. But the fundamental idea that we take care of each other in a medical sense, I think is actually a good idea. Now, that being said, as we get older, we baby boomers get older, and I've written a paper on this, the projections based on OECD projections are that the share of GDP, the increase in spending on healthcare expressed as a share of GDP will go up by about 3.5 percentage points between now and 2040. So it's 25 years, 3.5 percentage points of GDP in today's dollars is about $75 billion. That's a big increase. So I think what you're going to see in this country is that provinces who deliver these services are going to be pushed to try to come up with better ways to do it, but they're also going to naturally be pushed to ask for money from the one entity that has a pretty good set of financial books, and that's the federal government. And we are going to see, and we're right at the beginning of this now, we are going to see the demands for greater health care transfers from the feds to the provinces. And we as a set of governments are going to have to think about whether we cut other spending or increase taxes to pay these bills.
Take your rejoinder time, Chris, you're on it.
And so I think how we should do this is in a heads-up, compassionate way.
And just a very quick, I noticed I was accused the other day of not answering the question or addressing the issue, so I'll just toss it back to my good friend. The question that I asked wasn't really answered. It's the business of giving money to the sick folks is a matter of morality, of what we owe them, what's fair, what's is morally defensible.
Can you just say a word,
but the
Tom?
economist's
Because
concern is with
we've got to vacate the room.
But the economist's concern is with productivity, and the question is, what is the most productive way to allocate resources across the population when those resources are, I think, are currently moved from healthy people to sick people? Is that the productive way to move resources around?
We've got to stop. Tom, Omar is here.
I stopped.
Can I have a 20-second rejoinder?
Yeah, okay, 20
That's
seconds.
not the only question that matters.
No, it's right.
Efficiency
You're right.
matters, productivity matters, it's not the only thing that matters. So one of the things that we are going to do, I predict that as these healthcare expenditures rise, governments will be led to cut spending on, let's call them stupid things, like, I don't know, loans to Bombardier, okay? And we will also raise taxes a little bit. We'll end up doing a balance of less spending on this, this, and this, and more taxes on this, this, and this, until we close that gap that's 3.5 percentage points of GDP. And this will be a fascinating political discussion that you will be engaged in over the next 20 years.
I agree.
Thank
of course,
you.
it is
Thank
a
you
trade-off.
both. That's very kind of you. I think I was thinking of asking these two to shake hands in good manner before they left, but I think we'll pass on that just in case.
very quickly?
Yeah. So again, thank you very much to all our professors. We've had user-submitted questions, and due to us being short on time, we're going to quickly have like 10-second, 30-second snaps. So the first one, and if you have a question, we're probably going to take one or two. You can please stand to the
10
mic
second
there
answers, eh?
and ask. So the first one is from Gabriel, and the question is about the Dodd-Frank Act. So there are murmurs from Washington that the current administration might potentially revoke the Dodd-Frank Act, and the question is that will that be potentially lead to another crisis, either in the States or globally? Just 10, 20-second rebuttals.
Dodd-Frank is certainly under attack. Lots of parts of it are irrational, highly political. Some of it makes some sense. It's going to be rewritten for sure.
There will probably be another crash with or without a repeal of Dodd-Frank. The question is, how do we reduce the likelihood and the cost of that crash when it occurs? Dodd-Frank, do it carefully.
All right. Since there's no more
Hard to do.
questions, is there one more? I don't know if the mic is switched on, so you can just, can you switch it on? Yeah. Real
Well,
quick.
Yeah, so quick question about the
10-second question.
historically Canadian and U.S. interest rates move closely. Janet Yellen supposedly is going to raise interest rates soon. What are the implications of that for the Canadian economy? How can we better prepare in terms of the currency and in terms of trade competitiveness?
Okay, so the question is, as the Federal Reserve increases its interest rates, probably ahead of Canada, that's the question? What does it mean for Canada?
Exactly.
That's the question? Tom, you want to start?
It's a sensible thing and long overdue, but the official interest rate has nothing to do with credit availability or the rational allocation. The interest rate that you're talking about is a rate between the central bank and its client banks. The real interest rates in terms of credit availability have been pretty tight, and the issue has been, as I keep insisting, too much credit has been devoted to short-run projects, and too much credit has been speculatively allocated rather than allocated for the long run. And I don't know that the Fed is when it raises rates, is going to change that in the short run.
I think when the Fed starts or continues raising interest rates, if they do it well, it will be a sign of a good thing. It will be the sign of a U.S. economy that is getting closer to potential, and the economy is growing faster. And so financial markets may not like it, or parts of financial markets may not like it when rates rise, but it'll fundamentally be a good thing. And while that will put stress on the Canadian dollar will depreciate if U.S. rates rise ahead of ours. But the fundamental strength of the U.S. economy is good for Canada, period.
I'm really sorry, but we don't have enough time for another question. So I want to hand over the mic to our president, Gordon. Please give him a round of applause.
All right, yeah, really sorry about that time sort of cutting off the rest of the Q&A period. I'm just going to take just a moment. I'd like to thank the professors who came out here and offered their thoughts. I think this has been a really educational event for everyone involved. I don't think anyone in this room failed to learn something, and so I'd like to thank you for that. I'd like to thank our audience for coming, and I'd like to thank my team of MSTS execs who have worked, tirelessly to make this happen, especially
Well done.
Omar. Omar over there, who's really had the vision for this, and so thank you to you. And so this isn't the end of the involvement with the MSTS this year. We've got a lot more events coming on. We've had some investors come in earlier in the year, and we've got some more coming up. So I invite you to like our Facebook page, follow us, hear about it. We're all about education and learning about economics and financial investing. And so if you'd like, our team's going to be downstairs in Gertz after this. Feel free to join us for a drink, talk to us about our club. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Very good. Very good.